What if your silence could echo louder than any words? What if, in the space where you chose not to react, you were actually commanding the deepest kind of attention? There comes a moment in every emotionally aware woman's life when she realizes that not everything deserves a response, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is absolutely nothing, especially when you've been ignored, dismissed, or made to feel invisible by someone you once gave your heart to. This silence is not about pride. It's not about playing games. It's about reclaiming a kind of psychological dignity that many of us were taught to trade away in exchange for crumbs of affection. From early on, we were conditioned, praised for being agreeable, rewarded for smoothing over conflict, taught that love means proving your worth again and again, even when the other person withdraws. But what happens when you stop chasing? When you stop filling in the blanks left by his silence and allow him to sit with the emptiness he created? There is a raw, elegant strength in restraint. A woman who doesn't explain, doesn't beg, doesn't retaliate, unsettles the entire dynamic, not because she's cold, but because she's finally awake, aware that energy is precious, that attention is currency, and that sometimes silence is the only language self-respect speaks fluently. Psychologically, this isn't about passive aggression. This is about what Freud called withholding investment, removing the emotional energy we've been conditioned to give freely, even to those who haven't earned it. When you choose not to engage, you're not punishing, you're protecting. You're creating space not only for him to reflect, but for you to remember who you are outside of his gaze. I want to be clear, this is not a video about manipulation. This is about mastery, the emotional kind, the kind that allows you to respond from awareness, not wounds. Because what often hurts most when we're ignored is not the silence itself, but the fear that we're not worth responding to. Freud once wrote that much of our suffering comes not from the events of our lives, but from how we interpret them. When we are ignored, we tend to collapse inward, to doubt ourselves, to reenact childhood wounds of abandonment. But what if being ignored isn't a sign of your inadequacy, but of their emotional limitation? Today, we will explore 5 psychological messages a woman can deliver without saying a single word. Messages that don't seek revenge, but radiate integrity. That don't provoke guilt, but provoke thought. Because the real power lies not in making him regret, but in making yourself remember. You were always the one with value. Let's begin with the first message, one that's less about presence and more about absence. There is a peculiar force in absence, one that doesn't scream, doesn't beg, doesn't announce itself, and yet it lingers. A woman's absence, when intentional and conscious, can become more magnetic than her constant presence ever was. Because when you step back, you allow a silence to fall that demands to be felt. Most women, especially those shaped by abandonment wounds, have been conditioned to fear absence. If I'm not present, the unconscious fear whispers, he will forget me. And so begins the pattern of overgiving, over-explaining, over-existing, as if our presence must work overtime to compensate for our perceived lack of worth. But here's the psychological paradox. Value is not proven by availability. It's revealed in contrast, in space, in distance. Sigmund Freud observed that the unconscious mind is drawn not toward what is logical, but what is symbolic. And absence is deeply symbolic. It awakens longing, curiosity, projection. When someone withdraws, we begin to idealize, question, replay. Why? Because in the vacuum of silence, the mind becomes a storyteller. This is especially true in emotionally uneven dynamics. Our man who once had your attention, your laughter, your responsiveness, your concern, will feel a shift when all that emotional labor suddenly ceases. Not because you've become cruel, but because you've reclaimed the very energy he once took for granted. And in doing so, you disrupt the entire rhythm of the dance. Let's speak plainly. When a man ignores a woman, he's betting on the continuation of a pattern, that she will reach out, that she will make excuses, that she will fold back into the role of the emotional caretaker, the one who softens the discomfort he created. But when she doesn't, when she lets the silence settle like dust on a table he never thought he'd have to clean, it forces a reckoning. He must sit with the absence and all the meanings it evokes. Did she stop caring? Has she moved on? Why isn't she reacting? This is where emotional space becomes transformative. It's not about making him chase, It's about refusing to chase yourself. Let's reflect on a woman named Anna, a woman who for years responded instantly to every emotional pull of her partner. When he distanced himself, she leaned in. When he became cold, she tried to warm the room. When he ignored her messages, she sent longer ones. Until one day something inside her shifted, not out of anger, out of clarity. She stopped. She put down the phone. She went for a walk. She booked a weekend alone by the sea. She returned to the things she had set aside: painting, reading, journaling, not to perform happiness, but to remember who she was when no one else was watching. And then, quietly, like clockwork, he returned, with curiosity in his tone, hesitation in his voice. "You've been distant." But Anna hadn't been distant. She had simply stopped reaching toward a person who wasn't reaching back. Here, Freud might suggest that the absence served a dual purpose. It interrupted the reinforcement pattern and allowed the unconscious fantasy to re-emerge. She became, once again, an object of interest, not because she played hard to get, but because she became rooted in herself. This is not about manipulating someone into noticing you. This is about reminding yourself that you don't disappear when someone else stops looking. You remain. And in your own presence, you discover something far more rewarding than external validation: emotional self-sufficiency. So, how do you create this magnetic absence in practice? You disengage from seeking. You withdraw your gaze. You turn your focus inward, not as a punishment but as a redirection. You begin with the simple acts that make you feel whole: a walk at your pace, a book that awakens your mind, a quiet morning with coffee and no need to respond to anyone. You resist the urge to post performative stories or curated images aimed at provoking him. Instead, you live, deeply and unapologetically, in a reality where your joy is not a performance, but a truth. And slowly, something powerful unfolds. He notices, but more importantly, you notice, that the woman who once waited for attention now carries her own. Because absence is not emptiness, it's space. Space where the real you, the one who exists without permission, begins to breathe again. In the next chapter, we'll explore what happens when you step back into the world, not to be seen by him but to be witnessed in your own light. Let's move now to the second message: the empowered presence, radiating confidence. There is a moment, subtle but seismic, when a woman stops entering a room looking for someone and instead walks in knowing she is someone. That is empowered presence. It's not loud. It doesn't beg for validation. It doesn't need to be framed, posted, or praised. It simply is, steady, magnetic, undeniable. Freud believed that much of our behavior is shaped not by logic, but by the unconscious needs we learn to satisfy through others. For women, this often meant becoming emotionally attuned to others' moods, adapting to avoid abandonment, shrinking when love required silence. Confidence, then, wasn't something taught. It was something many of us had to reclaim, slowly, after years of being told we were too much or not enough. The empowered presence is what happens when a woman no longer contorts herself to remain in someone's view. She stops performing relatability. She doesn't overcompensate for silence. She doesn't dress to provoke envy or disguise pain. Instead, she becomes a woman whose life is already in motion and whose confidence is rooted in how she treats herself, not how others respond to her. This isn't just about aesthetics or image. It's about behavioral energy. In behavior analysis, there's a principle called reinforcement history, the accumulation of all the rewards and consequences that shaped your responses over time. If your confidence was only ever reinforced by external approval, it became fragile. But when you start reinforcing your own behaviors, when you celebrate your boundaries, your solitude, your wins, even your quiet moments of resilience, you build internal reinforcement. That's when confidence begins to radiate, not perform. Radiate. Let's bring this to life with a brief, real example. Marta, 58, divorced after 22 years of marriage. For most of her adult life, she had been someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's emotional anchor. After the separation, she didn't know who she was, but she knew who she didn't want to be anymore. The woman who sat at home wondering why she wasn't called, invited, or remembered. So, she began small. She went to a local art gallery, alone. She signed up for a language class. She started walking every morning without her phone, not to be seen, but to see herself in a new way. When people asked how she was doing, she didn't default to fine. She said honestly, "I'm rebuilding," and it's powerful. Weeks later, she ran into her ex at a local bookstore. She smiled, exchanged polite words, and walked away with a grace that shocked even herself. She wasn't cold. She simply no longer needed to be noticed to feel real. This is the kind of confidence Freud would describe as sublimated, a transformation of emotional energy into constructive personal agency. She wasn't trying to make him regret, but in that effortless presence, something stirred in him, and more importantly, something settled in her. Confidence doesn't need to chase, it doesn't explain itself, and it certainly doesn't beg for reciprocity. So how does this look in your life? You stop orbiting his attention and return to your own center. You go to the event, not to be seen but to enjoy yourself. You pursue your interests, not to prove a point, but to reconnect with your own vitality. You speak when you have something to say, not to fill silence, but to honor your own voice. You laugh not to charm, but because something genuinely moved you. And yes, others will notice, especially him, not because you tried to provoke envy or regret, but because true confidence creates contrast. It quietly reveals who still depends on external validation and who has grown beyond it. Freud might say that this confidence unsettles those who once held power over you because it disrupts the reinforcement loop. You're no longer responding to their neglect with neediness. You're responding to your own value with action. This is how presence becomes your message. I am not waiting, I am living. In our next chapter, we'll explore the boundary within that presence, the quiet refusal to respond to being ignored, and how dignity speaks without words. Let's continue with the next message. The unspoken boundary, maintaining dignity. There is a kind of silence that speaks with the weight of a lifetime, not the silence of resignation, but of resolution, not the absence of words, but the presence of self-respect. When a woman chooses not to respond to being ignored, not because she's afraid or indifferent, but because she finally understands her value, that silence becomes a boundary, one that doesn't need defending, just maintaining. Many women were taught that to be loving is to be available, no matter how you're treated, that to fight for love means to stay emotionally open, even in the face of neglect. That love, real love, is proven through persistence. So when we're ignored, the compulsion to reach out isn't just emotional, it's behavioral conditioning. We were rewarded again and again for being the one who tried harder. But here's the deeper psychological truth. If attention must be earned through self-abandonment, it is not love, it's reinforcement. Freud understood that human behavior is shaped by reward and punishment, and sometimes by their terrifying unpredictability. Intermittent reinforcement, receiving affection inconsistently, is one of the strongest behavioral traps. It creates emotional addiction, where the moments of attention feel euphoric precisely because they are rare. The silence in between becomes a form of punishment, training you to crave his next response like a starving person waits for crumbs. And yet, the antidote is not more effort. It's the radical act of non-response. When you do not react to neglect, when you do not chase, explain, correct, or plead, you are not being passive. You are drawing an invisible line across your soul that says, I will no longer shrink myself to be tolerated. Take the story of Elena. In her mid-40s, after years of chasing emotionally unavailable partners, she finally confronted her own pattern. The last man she dated would go silent for days, then return as if nothing had happened. At first, she confronted him. Then she blamed herself. Then she tried harder, texting first, softening her words, pretending not to care. Until one day, after another long silence, something in her shifted. She didn't text. She didn't call. She didn't cry. She didn't explain. She simply stopped. Not because she had moved on, but because she had moved inward, toward herself, toward the deep understanding that love should not feel like waiting on someone else's inconsistency. This is what Freud might call the birth of ego strength, the ability to tolerate discomfort without acting impulsively. Elena's silence wasn't punishment, it was clarity. Her refusal to respond didn't come from arrogance. It came from a newfound dignity that said, I will not reward neglect with access. There is immense power in that kind of restraint, because when you no longer respond to being ignored, you remove the payoff. Think about that. If someone can ignore you and still get your time, your care, your emotional presence, why would they change? But when the silence they give is returned with stillness, not bitterness, not revenge, just stillness, the system collapses. The dynamic breaks. They're left to face the void they created and perhaps for the first time to feel the absence of your warmth. This kind of boundary doesn't require confrontation. It requires consistency. It means sitting with the urge to explain yourself and choosing not to. It means noticing the discomfort of being misunderstood and still not reaching out. It means trusting that self-respect is not always loud, but it is always felt. Freud said that we are not only shaped by what happens to us, but by how we respond to it. To maintain your dignity in silence is to refuse to let someone else's behavior dictate your worth. You are not cold. You are conscious. So how does this unspoken boundary manifest? You don't write the message just to clarify. You don't answer late-night calls out of loneliness. You don't pretend nothing happened. You allow the distance to remain. And in that space, you reclaim your center. Not all silence is equal. Some silence is submission. But this is sovereignty. In our next message, we'll explore what happens inside the other person when your non-reaction becomes a mirror. Because often when you stop engaging, they are finally left to engage with themselves. Let's move forward to message narrative 4, the reflective mirror, inducing self-assessment. When you stop reacting, something unexpected begins to happen, not just within you, but within the other. The silence you hold becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, he is forced to see himself, often for the first time, without the distortion of your forgiveness, your explanations, or your emotional labor. Freud believed that the unconscious mind is revealed not through direct confrontation, but through the gaps, the pauses, the slips, the silences. And in the realm of human relationships, few things are more revealing than the moment a woman chooses not to respond. Because here's the truth. As long as you keep reacting, you're shielding him from himself. As long as you explain, reassure, or pursue, you are giving him a story to hide behind. She overreacts. She's needy. She just wants attention. But when you stop, when you maintain composure, speak less, and retreat from the dynamic entirely, there is no narrative for him to cling to, only the echo of his own behavior. In behavior science, we call this extinction, the removal of reinforcement for a learned behavior. When someone's actions no longer get the expected emotional payoff, they're left with nothing but their own discomfort. And discomfort is often the birthplace of insight, if the person has the capacity to reflect. A man who once felt in control because you were always emotionally available now finds himself in the unfamiliar territory of uncertainty. He begins to wonder, why isn't she calling? Why didn't she respond? Did I go too far? In that space, he may face a confrontation he's never had before, not with you, but with himself, with his patterns, with his own avoidance, with the reality that someone valuable, once within reach, has withdrawn from the stage, not with a dramatic exit, but with quiet finality. Let's return to Freud for a moment. He once said, being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise, but honesty requires a mirror, and your silence, held not with contempt but with clarity, can be that mirror. Let's make this real. After years of emotional inconsistency, Julia, 49, stopped trying to decode her partner's silences. She no longer asked, "Did I do something wrong?" She no longer filled the space with apologies. She simply began to live, without explanation, without dramatics, without the desperate reach for closure. Weeks passed. Then a message came. You've changed. But what had changed wasn't Julia. What changed was the absence of the emotional safety net he had always relied on, the one where he knew she'd eventually come back, soften, smooth it over. Now he had only the echo of himself, and the questions that silence tends to provoke. Was I the one who pushed her away? Why does her absence feel heavier than her presence ever did? This is what happens when you stop buffering his discomfort. When you no longer act as the emotional translator for someone who refuses to speak the language of reciprocity. It's not revenge, it's responsibility for your own energy. And here's what matters most. You don't hold silence to manipulate his reflection. You hold it because it's the only way you can stop distorting your own. Because in truth, when we over-engage with emotionally unavailable people, we start to lose ourselves. We become consumed with their reactions, their moods, their silences. We forget to ask the only question that matters. What do I see when I look in the mirror? So what does this mirror look like in practice? You resist the urge to correct his perception. You allow him to sit in the consequence of his choices. You do not coach him into awareness. You let the emotional distance speak for itself. And maybe he begins to change. Or maybe he doesn't. But that's no longer your burden to carry. Because here's what Freud would have told you. You are not responsible for someone else's unconscious. But you are responsible for not making yourself small in order to protect it. So when he begins to reflect, that's his work, not your rescue. In our next chapter, we'll explore how this mirror can also become a window, one that opens back toward yourself. We'll shift the focus inward, toward healing through self-direction. Let's continue to message number 5, the subtle shift, redirecting focus inward. Something powerful happens the moment you realize that his silence no longer defines the rhythm of your day. That realization doesn't arrive with fireworks. It comes slowly, like breath returning to a body that forgot it was holding itself in. It begins with a subtle shift, not away from him, but toward yourself. After spending so much time watching for signs, interpreting his distance, questioning your own worth in the vacuum of his attention, you begin to feel tired. But it's a sacred kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes not from weakness, but from clarity. And in that quiet moment, a question arises. What if I turned all this energy back toward me? Freud believed in the concept of sublimation, the redirection of emotional energy into meaningful, constructive pursuits. Rather than acting out or suppressing your feelings, you transform them into something generative. That isn't denial. That is psychological maturity. It is the decision to stop pouring your life force into someone who doesn't hold space for it, and to begin nurturing the parts of yourself you abandoned to stay in his orbit. You see, when a woman stops reacting to neglect and starts investing in herself, she doesn't just heal, she shifts the entire narrative. No longer the one waiting to be seen, she becomes the one doing the seeing of her own potential, her own creativity, her own wholeness. This shift doesn't begin with grand gestures. It begins in the smallest acts. You read a book you've been postponing. You write one honest sentence in a journal. You replant a flower that's outgrown its pot. You book a class, a trip, a therapy session, not to fill a void, but to return to yourself. And suddenly, the silence that once hurt becomes a kind of spaciousness, a place where you can hear your own voice again. Let's meet Claudia, 62, widowed for several years, and recently entangled with a man who drew her in through charm but kept her emotionally off balance. She waited for his calls, rearranged her schedule to match his availability, ignored the knots in her stomach when he disappeared for days. And then, after yet another weekend of silence, something in her cracked open. Not in anger, but in awakening. She sat at her kitchen table and asked herself, what have I postponed in the name of being available for someone who isn't truly here? The answers were quiet but undeniable. A memoir she had wanted to write, a yoga class she once loved, a group of women she hadn't seen in years. She didn't block him. She didn't announce a dramatic ending. She simply began to reroute her energy. And from that moment on, something began to return to her, not from him but from within her own life. This is the subtle shift. You stop performing worthiness. You stop hoping that your silence will make him miss you. You simply decide that you are worth your own time, your own care, your own attention. Freud might say that this is the moment the ego reclaims its rightful place, not as a shield, but as a steward, a guide back to the self that has always existed beneath the conditioning, the people-pleasing, the emotional chaos. So what does this redirection look like, tangibly? You wake up and ask, what do I need today? Not to be seen, but to feel alive. You invest in something that has nothing to do with being wanted, and everything to do with becoming whole. You surround yourself with people who respond to you without confusion. You create, not to be praised, but to express. You rest, not to recharge for someone else, but to restore your own center. And you notice something. Your nervous system begins to relax. The compulsive checking of your phone decreases. The ache fades, not all at once, but enough to breathe again. And as your focus turns inward, you become your own mirror. You begin to reflect not on how to change for someone, but on who you've always been underneath the fear of being left. Because you were never too much. You were just giving too much to the wrong place. And now your attention is home. In our final chapter, we'll bring these messages together. We'll speak not about revenge or regret, but about the quiet liberation that begins when you finally understand the strength in silence. There's a silence that comes from hurt, the one where you curl inward, hoping someone will notice your absence and reach for you. But then, there's another kind, a silence that is chosen, grounded, sovereign. This silence is not the absence of feeling, it is the presence of clarity. It doesn't arise from defeat, it's born from a decision. I no longer respond to what diminishes me. Over the course of this reflection, we've explored how non-reaction isn't weakness, it's refinement. Each message, absence, presence, boundaries, mirrors, and inward focus, points to one truth. You are allowed to protect your peace, even when it's misunderstood. And when you do, you reclaim a power that no validation can replicate. In Freud's view, emotional maturity was not about suppressing desire or eliminating need. It was about understanding your patterns, your attachments, your wounds, and finally making different choices. This is the essence of freedom, not the absence of longing, but the refusal to be ruled by it. So what does strength in silence actually give you? It gives you space to listen to yourself, to feel what you truly feel, without someone else distorting the mirror. It gives you time to heal without pressure, without having to perform recovery for anyone else's comfort. It gives you direction, because the energy you once spent waiting, fixing, or hoping can now be used to build, to create, to choose again. And yes, silence changes things, often in ways you'll never fully see. The man who ignored you might begin to feel the emptiness you left behind. He might reflect, or he might repeat the same patterns with someone else. But that is no longer your business, because the woman who holds her silence with self-respect is not waiting for regret. She's not holding her breath for closure. She is done auditioning for her own worth. If he regrets, let it be his lesson. If he doesn't, let it be your liberation. You see, when you no longer need to be heard to validate your experience, when you no longer argue with someone's silence, but choose your own stillness, that's when you begin to see what real power feels like. And power doesn't shout. It doesn't plead. It sits. It watches. It moves on, without fanfare, without vengeance, without apology. Because the truth is, silence is also a response, and sometimes your greatest healing. It doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care about yourself more. And from that place you rise, not as someone waiting to be chosen, but as someone who has already chosen herself. Now, I invite you to reflect on your own experience. Have you ever used silence as a form of self-respect? What happened? In him, in you? Share your story in the comments. Your insight may be the mirror another woman needs. And if this video spoke to something deep inside you, don't forget to subscribe. Because here we don't do quick fixes or empty affirmations. We explore the layers of your behavior, your heart, your story, so you can finally live on your own terms.